So who are the Rugby World Cup favourites post-Rugby Championship edition? I've done a video like this on the channel before. It was either after the Six Nations, but I think actually it was after the Autumn Internationals last year. So it's a good time to reassess the question of who the favourites are to win in France. I think there's been a little bit of movement in there. I'm going to go through the various options and talk about the pros and cons of each team in this video, but make sure you drop a comment down below. I'd imagine there'll be plenty of you who want to have your say on who you think at this moment in time are most likely to win the Rugby World Cup in France. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel as well, but let's get into it. So before I launch into it, these are the current Rugby World rankings. Little bit of movement in the Rugby Championship, but not a huge amount really. So you've got New Zealand, who are now up to second, dropping France down to third, and then Fiji have come into the top 10 with their performances. But other than that, it's kind of as you were. And actually, sometimes the world rankings can be absolute nonsense. But I would say, generally speaking, I tend to probably agree with that. Might put Argentina above England. Some people might have France above New Zealand. A lot of people, I think, actually would probably have France as favourites for the World Cup because of the home field advantage, but we'll get into that. But I think, generally speaking, those world rankings for me at this moment in time are a fairly good reflection of who are the favourites for the tournament in France. So I'm going to go through the options. For me, there are three main favourites at the moment. It's Ireland and France, and it's New Zealand. And then I've got South Africa in a category probably just below those three at the moment of you can't write them off. But I think from just what we've seen from Ireland, France, New Zealand, for me, I have to put them above South Africa at this moment in time. And then for me, everyone else is serious outsiders: England, Scotland, Argentina, Australia. I'll mention them at the end of the video because I want to get into the favourites first of all. And firstly, those two Six Nations teams, France and Ireland. And the big thing, I think, about the World Cup, and it was something actually I heard an interview with Conrad Smith recently, the legendary All Black, won the World Cup twice in 2011 and 2015, formed that formidable midfield partnership with Ma Nonu. But he was speaking about World Cups and essentially made the point that they are different to everything else. The pressure in World Cups, the nature of the knockout games at the World Cup is different to, say, the 3 or 4 year cycle in between tournaments. And it was something actually that New Zealand had to come to terms with when they won in 2011, when they were always favourites for World Cups. They were never able to get it done. They hadn't won since the first World Cup in 1987, and then eventually they got over the line in 2011. And a big part of that, Conrad Smith said, was about identifying the fact that it's different at a World Cup. And so a big question mark over Ireland and France as two teams who haven't won it before. One of them who's a home nation, which on the one hand is an advantage, but on the other hand brings an element of pressure. And the other in the Irish, who are kind of have this tag of just never getting past the quarterfinals. That in itself is a pressure, as good as they are playing. And I think that's a really significant point at this World Cup, which will be fascinating to see how it plays out, of whether we do see that tend to or start to take a grip of those two nations. But Ireland, first of all, the number one ranked team in the world. I mean, I don't think there is an international side over the last probably 2 years who have played with the flow, with the continuity of that Ireland team on a consistent basis. We've seen it for periods from other sides, for example, from the All Blacks, the first 20 minutes recently in the Rugby Championship against the Springboks. They were absolutely sensational. But I think Ireland have been playing incredibly consistently over the last 2 years, the way in which they attack, the way in which they've developed that game plan. There is a reason that this feels different, this Ireland team, compared to others coming into a World Cup. Having said that, I think they do have weaknesses. And actually, I think a team like South Africa, for example, would probably look at Ireland and back themselves to be able to make life pretty awkward for them. If you look at Leinster as an example, and the way in which they came up with no silverware this year, losing to Munster, losing to La Rochelle, there is a feeling, I think, that a really big, monstrous pack and the kind of game plan that South Africa can implement could really trouble the Irish, potentially. And the fact that they meet in the group, that is going to be an absolutely mouth-watering tie in that pool to see who comes out on top. But we shouldn't forget how good they are, because I have been massively impressed with Ireland over the last few years. I've said it on this channel before, but I remember watching the first test of their tour to New Zealand, where they ended up winning the series, but they actually lost that first test. And even though they lost the game, I remember watching the first 20 minutes of that game and just thinking, Ireland have got something here. The way in which they were attacking, something was starting to click. And I think that's proven to be the case with what has happened since then. A big question mark, I suppose, over Andy Farrell's team is Johnny Sexton. He will be allowed to play because his ban basically means he misses all the warm-ups. But that in itself is significant. He's not going to have played since the Six Nations. He's a senior statesman. He's an experienced player. We know how good he is. That's a long time to have not played any rugby whatsoever. And also in a pool, particularly with playing South Africa pretty early on, where Ireland have to be on their game. So Ireland, incredible strength. Lots of very, very good players. Few question marks still there. Next on to France as well. I've mentioned the home pressure already, but I think that will be an element of the tournament. It will help them at times as well, no doubt. And I think France are interesting in the sense that they've dipped off a little bit. I think after doing the Grand Slam in the Six Nations in 2022, I don't think they were that impressive at the back end of last year in the autumn. I know they won all their games, but actually the performances themselves against South Africa, against Australia, where they almost lost. There was a number of performances which weren't as strong. And then again in the Six Nations, with the exception of just absolutely smashing England to bits at Twickenham. Again, I don't think we quite saw them at their best. I know they had that brilliant game against Ireland where they played pretty high quality rugby and just came up against a very, very good side. I think they've been more inconsistent, France. So the big question mark for me really is, has this been a slight dip for them to then be able to start peaking again ahead of the World Cup? Or actually, is it a sign that their best rugby has already been played? We won't know the answer to that until the Rugby World Cup gets underway. But for me, that is a slight question mark over them. And of course, if we're going to talk about players, Antoine Dupont running the ship, if he is on form, he is brilliant. Even if he's not on form, he's proven to be that good. He is already starting to carve out a legacy as one of the great nines we've seen, one of the great players of French rugby. A home World Cup, someone like him, he's going to be absolutely key. If he is on form, then I think France can do some serious damage in this World Cup. Let's get on to New Zealand. There's been a couple of things really that have been highlighted elsewhere already, and I've mentioned it before, in terms of the All Blacks from what we've seen in the Rugby Championship. Their pack is in a much better place. All of a sudden, I think they look like they've got a solid set piece. Their scrum went well against South Africa, who we know have a reputation for just absolutely mauling teams at the scrum. As an Englishman, I know that perfectly well from some of the recent games that we've seen between those two nations. And I also think there's players like Rico Ioane, Scott Barrett, who previously we know that they've been good, they've been poor, their form has been in and out. They've started the year really, really strongly as well. And they're kind of all of a sudden, they're on this, 10-game winning streak or whatever it is. They've got players in form, they've got a better forward pack, and you're starting to look at New Zealand, and I look at it and think, if they can continue to improve at the rate in which they are improving from kind of the end of last year through into the start of this year, if that is an improvement that is carrying on at a similar trajectory, man, that's frightening. Because for the first time in a long time, I think New Zealand will come into the World Cup with people saying, yeah, of course they can win it. We know that they can be so good, but are they the absolute favourites in the way they have been previously? Maybe not. And you look at that opening game in Paris, 8th of September, Friday night, Stade de France, France against New Zealand. That's exactly the sort of game that I can imagine the All Blacks being quietly confident of saying, yeah, we're going to lay down a marker here. Everyone's talking about France and Ireland and those two sides, and France at home. I spoke about the pressure already. We know we are good enough. Players in that squad have gone deep at World Cups. We are going to give them a bit of a fright to start the tournament. That wouldn't shock me at all. The other kind of couple of points really on New Zealand is they've started much quicker this Rugby World Cup year than normal. Normally they don't win the Rugby Championship in years when it is a World Cup. I saw someone on the channel before actually in the comment section suggested that was because they hadn't been playing as well in the year before the World Cup, so they needed to start quicker to get where they want to be ahead of the World Cup, which is a pretty decent theory, to be fair. I wonder whether it is that or not. I think it has been fascinating that they've picked pretty strong sides. There hasn't been quite the rotation that we've seen, say, with South Africa, who I'm just about to get onto. So that is interesting, whether they are able to continue that growth and that improvement. If so, they're going to be right in the mix when it comes to the World Cup. But they are not as dominant an All Blacks team as we have seen previously. As I've already hinted at, it isn't a case of a World Cup where it's kind of New Zealand versus the rest. They are in and amongst that pack. They could well win it, but there are other teams that are also worthy of mention in the same breath. So those are my three favourites at the moment. the one side I had as a team who I think could absolutely win it. I'm not writing them off, but equally I wouldn't be quite as confident of betting on them right now is the Springboks, because I've been slightly underwhelmed by South Africa to start the year. And I might be being a little bit unfair, because you look at their approach to the games they've had so far, and I think it's pretty clear that they are trying to peak in France. They are trying to hold their cards a bit closer to their chest, perhaps compared to some other teams. And part of the reason I guess I'm disappointed is because for me to really put them in the same breath as Ireland, France and New Zealand right now, I just want to see a little bit more evidence of that improvement. I think we saw that improvement at the back end of 2022. They haven't quite shown it to us yet in 2023. And as I say, that may be deliberate. In fact, I think it probably is deliberate. I think they will look back at 2019. They will think they've got a recipe of how to get the best out of themselves when it comes to the main tournament. And that's probably what they're trying to do again here. But it also leads to a few question marks, I think. I think there's still question marks over some positions in terms of, you look at 10, what are they going to do if Andre Pollard's not there? We don't quite know what's happening with Sia Khaleesi as well. Other positions, I mean, there's back row of who needs to start, what's going to happen. So yeah, the Springboks, those are the question marks. Here's the reason, and I have actually kind of mentioned it already, that they could go deep at this tournament and could win it. And that is because of their personnel and their game plan. I think the strength in depth they have available is frightening. The players they can call in, even when they're making changes to these games, you do still look at the squads and think, that's still a really, really strong squad. And then the game plan is the second point. And that is when it gets tough in a World Cup knockout game, when everyone's a little bit nervy, they have a game plan of set piece, of scrummage, of forward dominance that is incredibly handy to fall back on and rely on. And we know we've seen them develop their attack and be able to be more expansive in an attacking sense as well, and they will try and play that way. But I'm talking about those key moments, those fine moments, the inches in games. I think South Africa are quite well equipped to really potentially grind them out and make life very, very difficult for teams like France and Ireland, who may have some nerves about getting further at a World Cup than they've ever been able to do before. Whereas South Africa, as a nation, they've been there, they've done it, they've won it 3 times. So that's why I'm not writing them off, but hopefully in this video, it's kind of evident for why I can't quite have them at the top of the pile just at this moment in time. In terms of the others, Argentina on their day, I feel like could beat pretty much everyone. I don't think they're good enough to beat a France or an Ireland or a New Zealand, but they could beat England in that group. They can trouble a hell of a lot of teams. They could go pretty deep into the tournament. Australia, I mean, frankly, who knows? I'm going to try and find time on the channel to do a whole separate video on Australia, because boy, that's a fascinating one. Eerily similar, actually. I think a lot of people in England will be looking at Eddie Jones's press conferences, and it is eerily similar to what we saw from him over here as England coach. England themselves, we'll wait and see. Poor in the Six Nations, have been poor for pretty much the whole World Cup cycle. They've actually been able, England, in the past, in 2007, to get to the final in pretty similar fashion, being rubbish in the years between the tournament, being rubbish in the first game of the tournament when they lost 36-0 to the Springboks, and still being able to get to a final. And actually, that final was really close as well. So you never know at the World Cup. Because of the draw as well, that's the obvious thing that I'm sure many of you will be thinking is England, Australia, Argentina, Wales, on an easy side of a draw, don't have to play that well to get themselves to a quarter-final or maybe even a semi-final, whereas the favourites that I've mentioned, they are going to have to slug it out. They are going to have some pretty tough games just to get themselves to a semi-final. So that could change things, but I think purely on paper, those are the teams that are favourites at this moment in time. I'm going to save my prediction, I think, before the tournament. I'm sure before the tournament kicks off, I will do a full World Cup preview where I will stick my neck out and say who I think is going to win. But we've still got World Cup warm-up games to come. We've still got to see what squads are ultimately selected. And obviously injuries will come into it as well. So I'll keep my cards close to my chest a little bit, like the Springboks are doing at the moment. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Who are the favourites for the World Cup? Do you generally agree with my assessment, or how do you see things at this moment in time? Because it's, about a month away now. It's getting pretty close. Yeah, it's going to be pretty exciting. So drop a comment down below, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.